Good morning, and welcome to today's Atlantic Council event, Strategic Shifts, Insights from the Commission on the National Defense Strategy Commission Report. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm the Vice President and Senior Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. The United States and its allies face a dangerous international security environment with a major war in Ukraine, conflicts in the Middle East, increased Chinese aggression against U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific, and moreover, increasingly, these rivals are working together in what some have called an axis of aggression, most recent example of which is North Korean forces on the battlefield in Ukraine. So the challenge facing the United States and its allies is how can they work together to deter and, if necessary, defeat multiple adversaries in overlapping timeframes. The final report of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, which was released earlier this year, clearly addresses this question, outlines the global threat environment, and provides recommendations for how the United States can and should respond. The Commission, created by Congress, recommends that due to increased threat of both China and Russia, and the likelihood of simultaneous multi-theater conflict, the United States should adopt a multi-theater force construct sized to defend the homeland, deter and, if necessary, defeat simultaneous threats in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. As we look forward to the future of U.S. defense policy, today's discussion will provide an invaluable opportunity to reflect on these findings and consider their implications for the next U.S. national defense strategy for the Trump 2.0 administration. So to discuss these issues today, we're very fortunate to have some distinguished guests. We're fortunate to be joined by the Commission's chair, former Congresswoman Jane Harman, and Vice Chair, former Ambassador Eric Edelman. Congresswoman Harman served 9 terms in Congress as the U.S. Representative for California's 36th Congressional District and was the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee after 9/11. After leaving the House in 2011, she was the first female president and CEO of the Wilson Center until 2021. She has served on numerous government advisory boards, including for the Central Intelligence Agency, Director of National Intelligence, Department of Defense, and the State Department, and is currently a member of the NASA and DHS advisory councils. Ambassador Edelman served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republics of Finland and Turkey and was Principal Deputy Assistant to the Vice President for National Security Affairs. From 2005 to 2009, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where I had the pleasure of serving as an intern in his strategy office. He's been a practitioner in residence at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. He has also served as the co-chair of the 2018 National Defense Strategy Commission, as a commissioner on the National Defense Panel Review of the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review, and a member of the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel. Moderating today's event will be the Scowcroft Center's Director for Programs and Operations and Senior Fellow, Tressa Ganov. Meetings like this are central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies. We also honor the legacy of service of General Brent Scowcroft, including his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Within the Scowcroft Center, our Forward Defense program generates ideas and connects stakeholders in the defense ecosystem to promote an enduring military advantage for the United States and its allies and partners. Its work identifies the defense strategies, capabilities, and resources the United States needs to deter and, if necessary, prevail in future conflict. So before I turn it over to Tressa to get started, today's event is public and on the record. Thank you all very much for joining the Atlantic Council for I know what will be a captivating conversation. And without further ado, Tressa, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate the introduction. I think what we'd like to do is just, since the Commission came out with its original findings and recommendations, there has been an election. Of course, we're eager to hear what you think stays the same, what will need more work, what will need different articulation to a different, to the Trump 2.0 administration, as Matt called it, and what you really hope transcends any kind of change in administration with this recommendation, set of recommendations from the Commission. I think we can start in a number of places, but I'll go to budget first because with the Republicans having the House and Senate, likely Chairman Roger Wicker of the Senate Armed Services Committee says he would like to go up to 5% defense spending, at least temporarily, as he has characterized it. So with that sort of set of players, Congress, the new Trump administration, how should the Department of Defense under Trump prioritize spending? And do you think we can get increased defense spending in this environment regardless?
Well, let me first say thank you to the Atlantic Council and to say to everyone that I personally have the fondest memories of Brent Scowcroft, who I think we miss more than ever. And if he were here, the world would be better. That is my view. I also want to mention that in this audience is David Granis, who is the director of the report, who has a storied Hill career both in the House and Senate, and worked at DHS, and started his career working for me because everyone else in this room worked for Eric. So I'm just
included.
Yeah, I'm just feeling a little defensive here. On the budget, the train has left the station. Congress hasn't passed a budget. Thought I would share this with all of you. The fiscal year started October 1. We're in a CR, and rumor has it that the CR will be extended until the end of March, and then there'll be a big fight. But certainly our commission did look at budgeting. We looked at a lot of things. I hope we get into the other things we looked at. And we would not have a problem raising the defense budget. But our point was we need to spend smarter, not just more. We spend a lot on the wrong stuff. The industrial base of the Pentagon moves at the speed of bureaucracy. It builds to requirements to win the last war. The things we build, many of them with hardware, are vulnerable. And in the threat environment we now find ourselves, we need much more software-based, iterative, cheaper defense goods. And managing that process is going to be tricky. I'll just say one more thing, because I'm sure Eric has lots to add. I represented the aerospace, I called it the Aerospace Center of the Universe in Los Angeles for my 100 years in Congress. And when there were reforms proposed, which were good, many of them, to what we made there, the first question was, well, where will the jobs be? So if we're changing the defense budget, we have to be sensitive to the political environment. And I think this new DOGE group will find that out on day -1.
Yes.
So, Teresa, first, let me add my thanks to Jane's, to the Atlantic Council for hosting us today. It's great to be with you and with Matt again. And let me just pay tribute to Jane's leadership as chair of this commission, because one of the things that's, I think, unusual about our report is that it was a bipartisan, unanimous report, and a lot of that had to do with Jane's leadership on the commission. To the point you raise about what stays the same, what's different, and how should we think about resourcing for defense. One thing that stays the same is the threat environment, which Matt kind of alluded to in his opening remarks, and which we found as a commission unanimously represents perhaps the most difficult, challenging international security environment the nation has faced since the Second World War. I mean, the Cold War, was, not a small thing, but we're now not facing a kind of single superpower opponent. We're facing as Matt noted, a increasingly integrated challenge from the PRC, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and that is not something I think to sneeze at. There's a lot of discussion. I mean, we recommended in our report 3 to 5% annual real growth as a ramp up to what we described as Cold War levels of effort. That roughly overlaps with what Senator Wicker has proposed, as you noted, although we came to that completely independently. You hear occasionally that our political system is not capable of that today, that there's not political support for that today. And I would submit that, that to the degree that that is the case and that that critique has any purchase, it's a function of the fact that the political class in the United States, and I mean that across party lines, across multiple presidential administrations of both parties, has not really had a frank conversation with the American people about the challenges we are facing, although the headlines are beginning to make that increasingly clear, including some of the things Matt mentioned in his opening remarks. The Reagan National Defense Forum that was hosted at the Reagan Library over last weekend unveiled a survey which shows extremely large numbers of the public, when asked questions that focus on this, support increased funding for defense. They support a force structure that, as Matt mentioned, we recommend, which is that the United States be able to not only fight one war at a time, but be able to defeat two adversaries or more at a time, as we proposed. And I think, again, what is needed in order to activate that public opinion is political leadership. And it's both in the executive branch and the legislative branch, and it's on both sides of the aisle.
If I could just add one thing to that. Yes, we are recommending higher levels of spending, but spending on the right things. But we also say that the national debt is its own national security challenge. And if we're raising the defense budget, we need to pay for that. And we call for raising revenues for this purpose, and we also call for reforming entitlements, which I know is a no-no for both parties. But I survived as a blue dog in the Congress for a long time, calling for reforming entitlements, and I think it's time to put that back on the table. And just to add one other thing to what Eric said, I think we all know that foreign policy polls at 1% if you ask people what they care about. But it depends how you ask the question. If you say, should we secure America against the threats we face now and in the future, the answer is different. And it does require and will require presidential leadership to make that case. And I hope that the new administration is listening because they're up and the world is getting more dangerous, not less.
Yeah, and with that context, I think it's still very unclear just how the Commission's recommendations will land with different parts of the administration. I think it's going to be a complex proposition, that it won't be monolithic. And so I think that it's going to be important to continue conveying that message. But with the new administration on the horizon, how can the incoming leadership ensure sort of continuity and an urgency in addressing the strategic challenges outlined in the report? And also, how do you think it should begin tackling, if it does indeed embrace the multi-theater force construct, how should that be prioritized in its initial work, both with the NDS and then actually sort of functionally in its day-to-day encounter with all of the threats that you've just outlined?
Let me say a few things, and Eric will correct me. The national defense strategy that we critiqued, we were set up by Congress, as Eric explained, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. Our report is unanimous, and clearly it was bipartisan. The NDS that we critiqued was produced before Russia invaded in an unprovoked, illegal fashion Ukraine, and before the meltdown in the Middle East, which is getting worse, not better, last time I looked, Syria, et cetera. And before North Korea was providing troops to Ukraine, et cetera, and this coalition of 4 was formed. So it was a very, very different world. And that's a point we make. Going forward, there will be a new national defense strategy, probably produced on the watch of the president-elect, We were disappointed because we had hoped that the national security strategy, which is embedded in the NDAA, which is hopefully going to pass Congress. I mean, that's one of the only must-pass bills that ever seems to pass these days. But we had hoped that it would be more outward-looking, because our view is that to deter or win future wars, not only do we need a different force structure, which I'm sure Eric's going to talk about, but we need a different mindset. And what we need to project is not DoD hardware. I'm not diminishing the need for some of it, but we need to project all elements of national power, and that is DoD lashed to the tech sector. I made that point before. I mean, the tech sector has a better business model and produces stuff much more necessary to fight and win the next wars, but lashed to various federal agencies, especially the State Department and AID, Commerce, Labor. They all play a role, and lashed to partners and allies. And the NDS has never taken that look. It's gone straight into the silos of the Pentagon bureaucracy. And that is a mistake. And if we're going to think about, again, deterring and winning future wars, deterring first, we're not promoting fighting wars, we really have to take a different view of strategy.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think the incoming administration would be wise to start with a focus on the homeland, because one of the points we make in our report is that if we get into a conflict, including particularly in the Indo-Pacific with the PRC, the homeland is not going to be a sanctuary. And the American public, I think, is not prepared for what it would face in that kind of contingency. And I think it's been discussed to some degree in open testimony by FBI Director Wray in terms of how the PRC is sitting on our critical infrastructure here at home in cyber. But I don't think the public completely appreciates what that would mean potentially in the opening days or even in the run-up to a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. More broadly, I think the last two NDSs, both the 2018 Trump NDS and the 2022 Biden NDS, have treated the potential for conflict as a set of severable propositions, that we could focus all of our attention on essentially what's described in the 2022 NDS as the pacing challenge, which is the PRC, and hold all other threats, at bay, essentially with our nuclear deterrent, which is in the process of being modernized, and luckily for our work was being addressed very well by the Strategic Posture Commission, which reported out slightly before ours, and we incorporated by reference their recommendations for the nuclear deterrent. But I think it was our view that whether that ever represented reality or not, it no longer represents reality. And therefore, we have to have this more multi-theater force planning construct. Now, that doesn't mean we need to be prepared to win 4 wars at a time, which some critics have accused us of recommending, because not all of these conflicts are going to, be the same, require the same set of capabilities on the part of the U.S., and they're all going to take place in a different allied context where working, with and through allies will contribute to the common defense and our ability to deter. But it's got to be done in a way that prioritizes essentially a very clear distribution of labor with allies, more clear than it's been in the past, and probably some new efforts to strengthen those allied relationships and allow them to function in a way that maximizes contributions to deterrence and defense.
If I just could add a couple of things. We're already seeing that combo with allies in our aid to Ukraine. The U.S. doesn't have boots on the ground. There are some people on the ground, but we're not fighting that war on the ground. But we are in Wiesbaden, Germany, through a facility, coordinating with others to surge both intelligence and equipment into Iran and into Ukraine, and it has been enormously helpful that we are doing this. It's also turned out, and we were there, that the Ukrainians themselves have developed a robust industrial base and are able to make some weapons, especially drones and tanks, on their own with their technology at much cheaper prices than we could ever produce. And imagine a future if this war ends on reasonable terms, and let's all hope it ends on reasonable terms, which to me mean, speaking for me, that Russian aggression is stopped and prevented for the future into Ukraine. But they could be the industrial base for Europe, and they could build on a kind of startup nation concept a real robust economy, future economy for themselves and for Europe. So that's one of the good things that could come out of this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and let's talk about allies a little bit more, particularly NATO, and how the Commission sees the future there with, between the United States, its role in NATO. As you noted, countries have in Europe and the United States have given a lot of their capabilities to Ukraine. There is now a question of readiness over the next 4 years to see that those be replenished in a modernized way, in an interoperable way, and the role that industry is going to play in that, because the Commission is pretty clear that you think that it's going to be a big challenge. So looking ahead for the Trump administration in that lens, but also just the lens between NATO and Europe and the EU, and then also the US role in creating a ready Europe and creating a ready relationship with the United States in terms of its own NDS priorities. How do you see that unfolding? With the Trump lens, Trump has pushed for more spending above 2%, pushing for 3%, pushing for burden sharing in a sort of not defined manner. How does the Commission see that future and what's most important in the near term?
Well, to begin with, I think President Trump has been right, and he's not the first president to suggest that our allies need to contribute more. And I think he's been successful in getting that message across to our European allies, and most of them now are moving to 2%, some beyond 2% of GDP in terms of their defense spending. But let me go back to the point you made, Tressa, about readiness and replenishing stocks that have been drawn down for Ukraine. I mean, the current administration, is running into some real difficulties, I think, drawing down all of the monies that have been authorized by the Congress for aid to Ukraine, because the money under presidential drawdown authority is now bumping up against the fact that we've already drawn down our stocks quite a bit to help Ukraine in some key munitions areas. And one of the unintended, I would say, benefits of President Putin's, as Jane pointed out, unprovoked, illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, is that it's highlighted the fragile state of our own defense industrial base. And one of the things we call for, of course, is a major investment in the defense industrial base. I would note that the incoming chairman of the Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, former leader McConnell, endorsed that over the weekend at the Reagan National Defense Forum. But even if our recommendations are all implemented and we're wildly successful in increasing the capacity of the U.S. defense industrial base, and there's a whole discussion we can have about that, and it's something you know something about from your time in the private sector, but we need our allies to step up and produce as well. As you've pointed out, they are also providing from their own stocks and from European defense production aid to Ukraine. But if anything, the European defense industrial base is, in even worse shape than ours. So, this is going to require a lot of investment, both here in the U.S. and with our allies. It's going to require, I suspect, us changing some of our own procedures, simplifying the international trade and armaments regulations, smoothing the path for intelligence and information sharing with allies, all of which we recommend. But it's also going to require, some pretty serious investment by our European friends and allies. I would note that in the report that Mario Draghi did for the European Union, in which he recommended a €1 trillion investment in production capability, a chunk of that is for defense industry, and I would hope that the U.S. would welcome that and encourage that.
If I could just add a couple things. The EU is on this problem, and NATO does not require interoperability of equipment that's provided anywhere. And so it's possible, and in fact it is actual, that a lot of what they're sending to Ukraine has different mechanics and different requirements for operation, which is very inefficient. And there is a move now that NATO will try to move to more interoperability. But Europe sees the opportunity of building a much more robust base. That's one point. The second point is, and it's true for our industrial base too, we don't want to build the same old stuff. We want to build the stuff to deter and win future wars, which is less expensive drones, some of the stuff that Ukraine already makes, et cetera, and stuff based much more on our tech sector and the way it absorbs risk and the way it operates. And to his credit, former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter established a DIUX, then was called. Now it's the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, which is ably led by somebody named Doug Beck, which leverages a small part of the defense budget to provide for innovation. And I've called for outsourcing the entire Pentagon to DIU, but I don't think anyone's taken me up on that yet. But certainly, this function is crucially important. And to her credit, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kath Hicks, has a replicator initiative, which is to provide drones and much more innovative drones. And this is the change we need. And hopefully, the incoming DOD will embrace this change. But it's not just inside DOD. It is looking outward to leverage the rest of our government to be much more effective.
Yeah. And let me just take a pause here to remind the audience to submit Q&A to askac.org. So we will take questions here in just a minute. But I wanted to take up a little bit more about the defense industry piece, because I think that the solutions for that are going to be, going to require a different way, as you noted, for the department to do business. But also, from a global perspective, I think that it can serve a function of serving as a stronger bulwark against the axis of aggression or the axis of upheaval, and some people have many different other names for that. How do you envision that actually working from an implementation perspective with allies, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific side? And then also, how do you see that sort of standing as a key element from the multi-front concept that you would like to see realized? I think that particularly, to me, this is just a real foundational piece to actually realizing not just the equipment piece, which you talk about, but really the actual strategic kind of realization of the multi-front concept. So I'll turn it to you, Ambassador.
Well, so the system we have now in the Pentagon, and I will note in a rare moment of humility that many people have broken their pick trying to fix, going back to David Packard, the Pentagon's, procurement and acquisition system. So I approach this in, really in all humility. But the system is optimized to procure, I would say, over-designed, highly exquisite platforms that are extremely expensive, take a long time to deliver to the warfighter, are extremely vulnerable, and become items that you are afraid to lose, and therefore limits your willingness to actually deploy them. And you and I actually had some real-world experience of that, back in the late Bush 43 administration. That doesn't mean we don't need platforms. I noticed that some people have been, tweeting or Xing or whatever about all we need is drones. Look, we need, as Jane has been rightly saying in this conversation, cheap, attritable systems in large numbers, and it's both in the air, on the surface of the sea, and under the sea. We need them.
Including ammo.
But also smart munitions, and this is the key point. We need systems that are attritable, but that also can be reprogrammed and are programmable. We're talking about loitering munitions or UAVs, but also can operate in tandem with some of these other platforms and operate together. We're going to need both, and that's one reason why the resource piece is so important. But that's going to take a very different way of thinking for the department. And even Replicator, which I agree with Jane, is a hugely important initiative by the department. And to be completely fair to the Biden administration, Secretary Austin has also had a Replicator 2, which is a counter UAS effort, which is also very important. But even wildly successful, those initiatives are going to produce attritable systems in the tens of thousands. We're watching on the battlefield in real time in Ukraine that these systems are being deployed in the millions of numbers. So if you think about what a high-end conflict in the Indo-Pacific might look like, you're talking about very, very large numbers of these systems. And this is, again, where allies come in, because we have to figure out ways to, we're not going to be able to do this on our own with our, just defense industry producing for the Department of Defense in the United States. It's going to require production and sales to allies. It's going to require co-production with allies. We have some of that going on already with Japan, for instance, and now under AUKUS with Australia, and particularly the Pillar 2 of AUKUS. But we're going to have to do much more of that in the future in order to be able to deter these challenges.
If I could just add a couple things. I don't know how many Americans can find Taiwan on a map. Thought experiment. But if you go to Japan, I think most Japanese can find Taiwan on a map. And we went to Japan, and we went to Indo-PACOM first, but then we went to a military base in Japan. And what you learn there is they're very sophisticated, big surprise. They could obviously do things like repair our equipment rather than having it shipped back to the US and back to theater. That makes absolutely no sense. But they can co-produce and add to a very effective strategy to deter and win any Chinese aggression against Taiwan, which is it's an existential threat to us too. Eric is right that China's already here, certainly in our infrastructure, critical infrastructure. But nonetheless, we miss a beat if we don't cooperate with allies. I just want to add one more thing. Thought I'd mention Congress, the incredible shrinking Congress. It's not just about budgets, but it's about how Congress looks at changes in the defense budget. Obviously, one huge worry, and this is reasonable, is jobs. But another huge worry is, how do I get credit for having some role in shaping the defense budget? Congress adds requirements all the time, does sometimes productive but often unproductive oversight over delays and mistakes. And what happens is, instead of thinking about how can we change this program to make it more effective, more software-based, just, again, thought experiment, it's how can we make it, how can we add requirements to what it's already doing and actually make it less effective in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Trust, if I could add one thing, our executive director would, I think it remiss of us if we didn't mention one of the other things we've talked about in the context of what you asked, which is something that both the 2018 and our report have stressed, which is it is still not clear that the Department of Defense has operational concepts for how we would actually fight these fights and how we can deter our adversaries by demonstrating that. So the department is now working on its third iteration of the joint warfighting concept, which I have on multiple occasions said is a little bit like the Holy Roman Empire. It's neither joint nor about warfighting, and it's not a concept. What it is, and I don't mean to denigrate it because,
You just did.
very good people are working on it and working very hard on it. But what it really is a series of pretty stovepiped efforts to solve various operational problems that our adversaries have imposed on us with what they have procured. But it is not the equivalent of what we did in the late Cold War when we developed air-land battle, assault breaker, NATO's follow-on forces attack concepts, which we then went out, not only procured things in quantity, but then demonstrated repeatedly in exercises in front of our adversaries to make them think really twice about whether they wanted to initiate conflict. And that's still, I think, a missing element in the department.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll get to questions here in just a second. I'll ask one more of you. I think the multi-war front concept really resonates with a lot of people. But I want to kind of make sure that to get the Commission's views on the gray space that's underneath sort of the traditional warfighting arenas that we would, could encounter, the United States could encounter. And this goes to particularly Chinese, Russian, and Iranian behavior, whether it's pushing bases in Cambodia or Gabon or Equatorial Guinea on the PRC front, or even going into the disinformation space where when the U.S. left Niger, for instance, the Russians were right there to fill that space and that vacuum with a lot of misinformation, and at a speed that the United States isn't really accustomed, the department isn't accustomed to responding to, and may never actually be able to achieve that because we still have some values in how we approach that problem. But I wanted to see how, from the theater construct perspective, you see those gray elements fitting into the Commission's recommendation, that space that is certainly below threshold of war, but extremely uncomfortable and also very effective from the adversarial perspective.
Good question. I mean, really good question. Good closing question before brilliant questions from your audience. Couple of things. Our defense/foreign policy is all about what we will not do, in case anyone has missed that. Especially in the Biden administration, we won't do this, we won't ship these weapons, they can't be used here, so forth. And President-elect Trump just said about Syria, this is not our fight. Well, okay, I think what he means is we're not putting boots on the ground in Syria. But I surely applaud what the Biden administration just did with strategic bombing to keep ISIS at bay in Syria. That is in U.S. interest to do that. And it gets into this whole gray conflict, short of actual land war, what are we doing? And this has been playing out for years, and we've been quite unprepared for this. As you raise places in Africa, I think of the Belt and Road Initiative. We had meetings, we met with 92 experts from our government and around the world. We traveled many places, including Ukraine, as I just mentioned. And we did meet with the commanders of Southern Command and AFRICOM, both of whom said the US military footprint in Latin America and Africa is shrinking, not growing. And not only our military footprint, our economic footprint. And China gets this. This all elements of national power is what China is doing against us. They're taking our playbook and trying to upgrade that. We did not say we would lose a war. We said we could lose a war. And obviously, we're not recommending fighting wars or boots on the ground. We're recommending deterring future war. So this whole area that you describe, and I know Eric will add much more to this answer, is what we're talking about. And if we think about, if we're stuck in our silos and we're thinking one war concept, we're going to degrade, not just improve U.S. readiness.
Tressa, I would say that both the 2018 and 2022 national defense strategies were cast as strategies for strategic competition with adversaries, great power adversaries, great power competition. The reality is we're not just in competition with our adversaries, but in the gray zone, as you note, both I would say the regional gray zone, whether it's maritime militias, acting in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or in the functional gray zone, which is the information area that you are talking about. It's primarily not necessarily the Department of Defense that has the first set of tools to use here, and we're in conflict every day in those areas, not just competition. And that's where I think the recommendations that we have for a whole of government, or really a whole of society approach, come into play. I mean, to your point about Russian activity, in the Sahel, well, first, I hope that the Russians now, given what's happened in Syria, lose their access to Khmeimim Air Base and to the Tartus Naval Base, which will make it very difficult for them to resupply the Wagner Group kind of leftover elements that have been subsumed into other Russian government structures. But I would also hope that the United States government will find a way to communicate not just to countries in Africa, but to the broader global South, that what is going on there is essentially a rapacious set of actions that are extracting rare earth and other mineral wealth from these African countries in order to fund Vladimir Putin's war and the operations of these mercenary groups at the expense of the people of the nations of the Sahel. And we used to be pretty good at that during the Cold War, but we've lost our ability to do that, it seems, and we need to regain it.
And it is a hard proposition to make, increasingly hard to articulate to countries around the world. So I'll turn to some of the questions from the audience. This one is on a DIB. Almost all of these are on the DIB, interestingly enough. So this one says, the DIB and the military are falling short in recruitment. To solve this, the proposed NDAA provides an additional 10% raise for junior enlisted personnel. This kind of gets to resilience questions too. I know that you took on in the commission. At the same time, unemployment has been at an all-time low for a few years with no end in sight. Is Congress appropriately allocating this large sum of money, or are they missing the mark just to do something? And I think that if I may just kind of build on that question, you took on this question in great depth as a commission on, how ready and resilient can the United States be to meet recruitment, but that's just a start. Realization of a robust, strong defense. So I'll turn that to you,
All right. Well, this was brought home to me because one of the things we did, or I did anyway, was to have a dinner with C.Q. Brown, our current chair of the Joint Chiefs, who was talking a lot about the impact of not just his career moves on his own family, but now the career moves on current families and how the family structure is different. And spouses often have jobs, and kids hate interrupting schools every 2 or 3 years. And that structure probably needs to be modernized. That's one point. Second point that was made by Jack Keane, who was a member of our retired 4-star general, Jack Keane, a member of our group, is that the recruitment structure of the services is, again, old model, very young people do the recruiting. And he said, why aren't the seniors, who are the ones who have reputations that the others will build, not saying that will never happen, but why aren't the seniors in the room? That's how they recruit for football teams. You know, why don't they recruit for something more important, excuse me if I've offended half the people in this audience, than a football team, which is keeping America secure. So I think that the all-volunteer force has had an impact. We're not recommending changing that, but we're recommending radical changes to the way we recruit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think I agree with everything Jane just said, of course. I would just add that we shouldn't underestimate the challenges that the all-volunteer force faces. I mean, one is a declining propensity to serve in a sort of 18 to 19-year-old age cohort, which is the primary age cohort from which we recruit, as well as a shrinking number of young people in that age cohort who can meet the physical standards. Some of that has got to do with changing technology for how we keep medical records. Is it really the case that anybody who had childhood asthma is not fit to serve? You might not have known that about a recruit 20, 30 years ago, but now because of the way we keep medical records, it's very obvious to everybody. Marijuana use. We've got marijuana legalized, I think, in 24 out of 50 states or something like that. So we're really going to, keep people out for marijuana use. I mean, these are kinds of things I think we've got to, got to think about, as we move forward. Childhood obesity. I mean, that's a big element here. The recruitment problem, in some sense, is a version of the larger social problems we're facing, and we need to, I think, face up to that as a society. The other thing I would add is that I think there's been a lot of talking down of military service, discussion that the military is woke somehow, which we did not find in any of our discussions with any, the senior officers or others. That if you join the military, you're going to end up with traumatic brain injury because we are involved in all these, quote, endless wars, although that has not been true for essentially a decade. So I think there are some, variety of things that we can and need to do.
One addition of good news is that when I served in Congress, there were almost no veterans in Congress. Now there's a huge increase in young members having served in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they bring direct knowledge. It's not all pleasant and fun, but they are much more interested in, I think, promoting military service and understanding what the real issues are and making Congress much more of a constructive player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good observation. I'll turn to another question here from one of our military fellows. And the question says, could you elaborate on the rationale of training and equipping the force for multiple theaters, vice training and equipping for the most dangerous or most likely threats, and then pivoting if necessary? An argument can be made that a multi-theater construct is more expensive and provides less specific deterrence. So that's...
Well, it certainly it is going to be more expensive. I don't think there's any gainsaying
right.
that. The problem, I think, is that much as we might like to prioritize one theater and prepare for one theater, the world doesn't work like that. It necessarily imposes itself on you, and we've seen that, I think, in Ukraine. I think we've seen that, now in the Middle East, where, which has been the area, by the way, where both the 2018 and 2022 national defense strategies have suggested that we, take risk. But the problem is that events will drive you back, and it's not, I think, a good thing to base a strategy on a set of assumptions about how the world works that are likely to be violated in the breach as you go forward.
Two comments to add. One is, think Syria. How many of us a month ago would have thought Assad would be driven out? And because of the vacuum created by the focus of major powers and even the degradation of a major terror group, Hezbollah. I don't think we would have imagined that, and yet the U.S. has interest in preventing ISIS from making Syria its new base of operation, because counterterrorism is still one of our goals. The other thing I'd offer, though, is I was at the Halifax Security Forum a couple of weekends ago, and the immediate past president of Taiwan was there, and she was asked, what's your view about repositioning some of the equipment from the Indo-Pacific to Ukraine? And she said, I'm totally for it. Why is she totally for it? Because if we don't push Russia back in Ukraine, if we set the example that the West is caving, then that's as she saw it, and I certainly agree, an invitation to China to move on Taiwan.
If I could just add, so if you think about U.S. assets in the CENTCOM AOR, we're obviously at way lower levels of troops there than we were 10, 15 years ago. But, on April 13th or whatever it was, and October 1st, we had to position a number of assets in the theater in order to defend, our partner Israel. And I'm glad we did that. I think that is a very good model, I think, for the kind of presence we need, which is not that we have to have hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground, but we do have to have the air and naval assets, the ISR assets that enable us to essentially provide a framework for defense for our allies in the region. And that's one way to conceive of how to do this.
So I'll turn to another question that, again, kind of a private sector DIB question. This comes from Andrew King, a venture capital investor. So he notes, as a private sector individual and venture investor, are there any economic incentives that you would recommend to encourage the private sector, defense tech companies, venture investors, to encourage them to devote more time and attention to public sector sales and to align goals with our national priorities in a more concerted manner? Again, I know you all did a lot of thinking about this, so I'd love your thoughts.
Well, look, one of the reasons that we have run into shortages of munitions is because the munitions accounts have been used to balance budgets at the end of every fiscal year in the Department of Defense with a promise that we'll get whole in the next budget cycle, and then it never actually happens. And as a result, when you then get this surge of interest in procuring more munitions, you get folks in the private sector who are basically saying, well, how do we know this isn't going to be a 1 or 2 year, fad, which, we're expected to front the cost of adding the floor space, factory floor space to produce these things, taking on the additional workforce, which is pretty highly skilled, that's very expensive to do, and that I think most people in the private sector will tell you that's really the long pole in the tent. It's the workforce, particularly in a condition of full employment. So one of the things you need is multi-year authorization and appropriations, and we've had some multi-year authorization authority provided to the department by Congress, but not appropriated dollars behind it. And you need, one reason why I think we called for the ramp up to Cold War levels of effort is you need some assurance to industry that this is not just going to fade away after 2 or 3 years, that there's going to be a persistent demand signal that will allow them to make the investment that will allow us to be able to surge production when we need to.
And we need a much more open marketplace. We shrunk the number of prime contractors in the 90s. The reason was that we had, in hindsight, foolishly downsized the procurement budgets for intelligence and defense. I know this because I was there trying to save the jobs. We did save them by promoting dual-use technologies and things of this kind. But there has to be access for smaller firms, especially software, tech-based firms. And there's industry money behind this if we can open up the procurement process to make them welcome there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, and again, the new administration will put a lot of questions to those set of issues that you just outlined. Will there be more money? Will there be more desire to kind of push on the business and economic side? And will there be that credibility as well for businesses to say, yes, I can invest, and it's good, there's a long-term business proposition for them as well. So I'll get at one last sort of broad theme that you all had pushed in the commission, which is this idea of a whole of government approach. And I know you touched on a little bit, but there's a question here that says, besides the tech sector and the Department of Defense, what other elements of national power should the United States leverage better to ensure it gains the edge over competitors and adversaries, from your perspective in the research and all the work you did on the commission?
Okay, well, that's a softball question. Yeah. But seriously, think about it. Who's lining up at what embassy in the world to get visas to come where? I don't think there are long lines at the Chinese embassy. I think there are long lines at US embassies around the world. Why are they coming here? Because America's values, which are being challenged at the moment, but the promise of America is still very appealing. And that means that our soft power, our values-based government that we need to work hard on to preserve, that is a bipartisan comment, is important. And one of the things we have pointed out is that our defense budget has to be lashed to our State Department budget. It's not a zero-sum game. If we're talking about all elements of national power, it is the combo of soft and hard power. And hard power doesn't only, again, reside in the Pentagon. I mean, sanctions and other economic measures that we take in other agencies are part of our hard power outreach. So putting the whole thing together and seeing, and hopefully the next administration will tackle this. It would be certainly welcome, and it would be, think about it from a DOGE perspective, much more efficient to do it this way. Mm-hmm. Well, think about our strongest weapon, which to me is our values and our soft power.
I would just add to what Jane said a couple of points. One is, when you think about, for instance, defense of the homeland and the kind of contingencies we were talking about earlier in this conversation, a lot of that doesn't fall to the Department of Defense, mm-hmm. but the Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce, Department of the Interior, but a lot of other agencies of the government, are potentially involved here, but have not been adequately resourced, prepared, trained, gone through the kinds of exercises that routinely we would go through in the Department of Defense, lack the planning capability that we have in the Department of Defense as well. A second thing I would add is, if you look at the problems of the defense industrial base, a lot of it is just a shortage of skilled workforce. We're short 300,000 welders in this country, which is one reason why, despite multiple commissions, Matt graciously mentioned that I'm a recidivist, and I've been on all 4 of these commissions since 2010.
Yeah.
But we've, in previous reports, advocated over and over again for a production rate of 3 Virginia-class submarines a year, because undersea warfare is one of our comparative advantages vis-a-vis the PRC. The rate of production was supposed to be, according to the NDAAs, 2 a year, but we're actually producing 1.5 a year. And that's because we're short welders, among other things, plumbers, electricians, et cetera, who can do a lot of the specialized work that goes on in the defense industrial base. As I said, this is highly skilled work, and we're not producing enough of these people. So the Department of Education has a non-trivial role here in the nation's national security, but I don't think enough people recognize that, including in the Department of Education.
And maybe the incoming administration as well, given some of the proclamations related to the Department of Education. But Chairwoman, did you want to say something to wrap up?
Well, I just, Eric gave me a little praise. I would just add to that he has been a wonderful partner. It took him 4 commissions to figure out
right.
what we ought to do in the country.
Yeah.
But this is a handout in front of the door, and we're very proud of it. I mean, it's rare, I think, to see a government report that's written in a readable fashion that really comes up with some achievable, we hope, steps to keep our country safer. And the things we should be thinking about right now are the complex and metastasizing threats against the United States. And it's not just a question of picking a few issues on other topics. We have to be ready. And this requires an all-out effort, certainly by this sophisticated audience. Thank you, Atlantic Council. Certainly by Congress. Please, Congress. Certainly by the executive branch going forward.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you as leaders of the commission, staff, and the members themselves, and all the folks who met with you to help make this possible. We're 3 minutes over, so I'm going to have to leave it there. Please get your copy of this going out, and thank you both for your time and your wisdom on this important issue.
And thank you for your excellent moderating.
Thank you. We'll conclude there. Thank you.